Thank you, Suki. I appreciate the invite, and it was really fascinating to hear about all the programs that Khaki is doing over these weeks. So I'll be sure to attend some more of them. All right. So I'm here to present what I think is one of the treasures of Indian history that I think a lot of people don't know about, and that is India's first newspaper. But before I talk about that, I wanted to tell you a bit about me. I wrote a book on Hicky's Bengal Gazette because I thought it was a crucial story that few people knew about but should know about, and I wanted to share that knowledge. All right, so a bit about me. I spent about 5 years researching on Hicky's Bengal Gazette, and it's taken me this journey from some beautiful libraries. Here's Morgan Library in New York, to of course, a few years in Calcutta at different archives, to the beautiful archives of Germany. Here we have a mission archive in Halle in East Germany. Of course, London for research, and back to India. And also very many sweaty train rides, including this one in Calcutta, my morning commute. And to give you a sense of what work was like, I wanted to show you just a quick video. This is an archive at the Madras University. It's a back room, and I was invited in by a professor. What I want you to focus on is not the books in bags, but here. These are newspapers in bound volumes, quite literally rotting on the shelves. These are all priceless newspapers from the 19th century. And a lot of my research was involved in going through volumes like this. All right, and also many local district records. Here's something in Tantulia in Bengal. The first misperception I want to correct before I continue is that there's no surviving image of the founder of India's first newspaper. And the closest thing we have is actually his signature here, James Augustus Hicky. And India's first newspaper was founded in 1780 in Calcutta, what was then British Bengal. And in particular, it was founded, and if you know the city well, you'll know a district called Radha Bazar in the center of the city. It was founded there. So these are the very first pages of India's newspaper, the very first, January 29th, 1780. This really revolutionized the spread of information in India. Previously, everything had to be handwritten, and now it's printed. What are some things you might notice? Well, you might notice first, there are no illustrations, and of course, there are no photographs. And technology comes for that much later. Second, you might notice there's no advertisements generally on the front page. This may come as a surprise if you are a reader of the Times of India. You may also notice there are a few headlines. News was often more like a letter to the editor, and news and opinion were all mixed in together. So it's called a Hicky's Bengal Gazette, or the Calcutta General Advertiser. That's the full name. You might also notice something interesting with the word advertiser. And what you see here is that this is actually an S and not an F. It's called a long or labial S. It fell out of fashion in the 18th century. Which is why you don't see it anymore. But as I go through the talk, if you notice a lot of Fs, those are actually S's.
Andrew, you've been muted, I think.
All right, how about now? All right. So I'm still muted. Okay. Here's an example of an article on the front page of India's first newspaper. It's about war in America, and it comes by a letter via Aleppo. So news has to travel almost a year to go halfway across the world. Here's more news. This is local to India. It's about a storm off the coast of Anjango, so would have been, I believe, Kerala now. All right, so here are the third and fourth pages of Hicky's Bengal Gazette. You'll notice that there's more commentary here. There's some practical information. We have departures, ships leaving the harbor, ships leaving Calcutta. We also have advertisements, such as this advertisement for some extremely good claret, a type of wine in Calcutta by the owner of Calcutta's library. There's even some poetry, such as this poem on joy and happiness. And so in case you're curious, the staff of India's first newspaper was quite small. It was led by James Augustus Hicky, and it was printed once a week, and it cost 1 rupee. That's approximately the same price as 3 kilograms of rice. So it's expensive, but it's not prohibitively expensive. It was around 22 by 36 centimeters in dimension, and the circulation was approximately 400 copies per week, although it's often read in groups in coffee houses, so the actual circulation is much higher than that official number. And it was founded by an Irishman. This is not unusual, in fact. For the first 40 years in India, almost all, or actually I think all newspapers were founded by Europeans. All right, so the editor, the founder of this newspaper, James Augustus Hicky, he arrives in India in 1773, and he had a sort of a checkered background. He had apprenticed as a printer when he was younger. His father had died, so he was an orphan. He even practiced surgery and actually worked in the slave trade in Africa. And looking for a new career and a change of life, he sailed to India in 1772, following this path. And this journey would normally take around 9 months. All right. So he arrives in Calcutta, he gets off the docks, and he starts a business. Unfortunately, the business fails when one of his ships was damaged in a storm. And by October 1776, he is in jail for debt. And at this time, while he was in jail, he has to pay for his own food, his own water, and his rent while in jail. It's a debtor's prison. So you need to make a way to make money if you're in jail. And he had borrowed money from a friend. He hired carpenters, he made types, and he smuggled in a printing press from outside the jail. And by 1777, he had founded Calcutta's first printing press, all while inside jail. And this probably was not the first printing press in Bengal, but just the first printing press in Calcutta. And so what is he printing? You know, he hasn't founded his newspaper yet. Well, he's printing things like this advertisement. This might actually be the earliest surviving document from North India. And what is it? It's actually an advertisement for goods from China. So we have international trade between India and China here. All right. And this probably was printed in 1777. I can't prove that myself, but it's one of those weird things in history that survives because it was actually used as a way to stiffen another document. So it was found sewn into the binding of a book in the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. It's amazing what survives sometime. All right, Hicky's Bengal Gazette, 1780 to 1782. So I'm going to tell you the story of the newspaper, and then I'll tell you a bit more about myself and how I found out all the information involving this history. So here's a typical front page of the newspaper. And what I want you to notice here is that most writing in the Hicky's Gazette was by men. And there's a few exceptions. And this article is by a woman named Old Nell. And she was she identified as an Anglo-Indian. Her father was Irish, and she sold vegetables. She was a greengrocer. And Hicky here gives her, if you know much about newspapers, you'll notice this is 1, 2, 3 columns and it's above the fold. So it's the most important part of the newspaper. It's the part where you have the most important information. Two microphones used. I only have one, so I'm not sure. So she writes, though my skin is not so white as your fine ladies, it is as plump and as sleek as the best of them. And so she's saying, I might not be a white woman, but I can still write, and that's I still value. All right. So what does she say? She says, must know, Mr. Hicky, my husband is a gardener. I am therefore up at daybreak, plucking my roots and washing them for market. From whence I return, generally by 9, but sometimes sooner, I eat a hearty breakfast, not of slip-slop tea, but of good congee. After which I attend to the domestic affairs of our little college, whilst my husband is plowing and working the grounds. And to answer the question, it was published weekly. Our dinner is generally made of wholesome curries and poultry from our yard. Congee again serves us for supper. Thus, we enjoy sound and perfect health, she says. So this is an example of some of the writing that would have been in India's first newspaper. And it's quite unusual and unique for a European-founded newspaper in India during this time to have contributions from some individuals who are women, who are Anglo-Indian, who are lower class. All right. Here's another article. I just want to share you a couple quick articles. This is about a fire in Calcutta, and it starts off, to the benevolent and powerful. Be it known that 15,000 inhabitants of Calcutta are since the late fires in extreme distress. The infants wailing in their mothers' bosoms increased the calamity beyond the power of language to describe. Think of this scene. Ye patrons of the unfortunate, exert your influence, clothe their nakedness, and give them habitation. So Hicky's using his newspaper here to make a public call to aid the residents of the city of Calcutta. Okay, so why is this Gazette interesting? Why did I really find this? Why did I write a book about this story, and why did I get into it? Well, it generally has to do with the interaction between the newspaper and our favorite people from Indian history, Warren Hastings and his wife, Marion, here on the left. And in particular, Hicky accused one of Hastings' aides of soliciting a bribe as protection money from the newspaper. And then Hicky writes, when there's so much corruption, what man can be safe where such schemes are practices? So he makes his accusation of corruption. And in response, Warren Hastings forbids Hicky from mailing his newspaper at all through the post office, and authorizing the search and seizure of anyone's mail suspected of containing this newspaper, because Hicky's Bengal Gazette was found to have disturbed the peace of the settlement, and therefore was no longer permitted to be circulated through the channel of the post office. So we have the beginning of a battle between authority and the newspaper and the press. What does Hicky do in response? So he's no longer able to mail his newspaper. Well, he starts sporting this slogan. It doesn't seem like much, but it actually means a lot. The slogan is a weekly political and commercial paper, open to all parties, but influenced by none. All right, so I had a really cool discovery. I was in the museum in Washington, D.C., and it's this beautiful museum. Unfortunately, it closed, but it had all these ancient newspapers from the 18th century, and I was pulling them out one day, and these drawers and drawers of newspaper. I just happened to pull out an American newspaper. This is the Massachusetts Spy from Boston, Massachusetts. And this American newspaper had the same slogan, open to all parties but influenced by none. And so did this newspaper from Virginia. open to all parties, but influenced by none. So we have Hicky borrowing or copying the same slogan from America. And this is quite remarkable because I later found out that the slogan was used by pro-American independence revolutionaries against the British. So by borrowing a slogan from the American Revolution, Hicky is also borrowing or signaling that this is his idea as he's independent of Warren Hastings, independent of the British authorities. And you can look at the dates. We have 1771 in America, and in India, 1781. So Hicky quite literally copied this slogan and all the politics behind that as well. All right. Well, here's Hicky continued publishing other articles against Warren Hastings and against the British government, East India Company, sorry, to be specific. This one's addressed to the quote, inhabitants of Bengal, countrymen and friends. It's a bit ambiguous, does he mean Europeans or does he also mean Indians? It's not declared. And what's important about this article is that he writes, or he has his writer says, government shall consult the welfare of the people, and the people shall obey government on that condition. And when that condition is neglected or violated, the people are no longer bound to obey. This is quite revolutionary. I mean, could you imagine, someone openly writing this during British time and as another European? All right. So that article got Hastings' attention, but it's really the next article that got the colonial authorities on notice. And this article, it was criticizing a peace deal, a treaty between the East India Company and a Maratha prince. It calls Hastings wild, pusillanimous, disgraceful, and so forth. But the most important thing of this article was actually at the very bottom. And I know it's difficult to read, but bear with me. Hicky says, it is reported that the great Mughal, meaning Hastings, is seized with a fit of despondency and political despair, and that the faculty, meaning doctors, are of opinion his perennial spring is out of order. So this is a really 18th century way of basically saying, challenging Warren Hastings' manhood. Perennial spring would be a way of saying that Warren Hastings he can't get an erection. He doesn't have the manliness to be able to lead British Bengal. Not surprisingly, Warren Hastings sues Hicky for libel for this article and for many others. And after a very dramatic trial, Hicky was found guilty and he was sentenced to jail. So why did Hastings sue Hicky for libel now? Why didn't he do it earlier? Well, the reason actually has to do with bribery. Hastings had bribed the judges of the Supreme Court. Here is Chief Justice Elijah Impey, one of the members of the Supreme Court of Bengal. And Hastings had given Impey a second salary and other perks worth a few lakh rupees. Hastings had also bribed the second judge of the Supreme Court, a man named Robert Chambers, more bribes totaling probably around 5 or 6 lakh rupees. And how do I know all this? Well, here we have a man named John Hyde. He was the third member of the Supreme Court at the time Hicky was tried, and he was an honest judge. So honest, actually, he wrote 20,000 pages of secret notebooks in which he actually wrote this secret code. It's an ancient form of shorthand where he recorded his fellow judges accepting bribes. And when I was in Calcutta, I came across these notebooks and I found this code. No one had really written about it before. So I sent it to a professor in New Jersey, and 2 years later, she was able to decode it. And here Hyde writes, before we went into court today, I know it's hard to read, Sir Elijah Impey told me at my house that he had accepted a commission from Warren Hastings. I spent many months in the National Library reading through microfilm of these notebooks. So here's just a sense of my day-to-day work. So 20,000 pages of that, looking for a secret code. It took, as you can imagine, quite a long time. I also have sort of an incredible story for you. I was looking for court records in the halls of Supreme Court in Delhi, and I was looking for archives. It took me forever to get access to this building. And when I was there, an archivist told me that they had burned all the records after partition. I have no evidence that what the archivist said was true. I just think he wanted me to go away. And I spent many months in the High Court of Calcutta as well. It was sort of a Sisyphean task. I had to request permission for each individual document. There was no catalog, so I had to make up my request without knowing what was there in the first place. It was madness. In the High Court of Calcutta, Suki, I know you talked about preserving archives. This is actually quite interesting. I found a issue of Hicky's Bengal Gazette that existed nowhere else in the world except in the High Court of Calcutta's archive. And this was the issue right before Hicky went to trial, right before he was sued for libel. I wrote 3 different applications for the preservation of this document, and I was rejected 3 times, actually, with no explanation given. So this issue of Hicky's Bengal Gazette is quite literally rotting in the High Court of Calcutta's archives, and it's the only place in the world that they have it. So it's really unfortunate. All right, so back to the story. Hicky was sued for libel. He's been jailed. It's now 1781, and him and his family are in jail. He keeps printing his newspaper, actually, from inside jail. I don't quite know how he did this. I have suspicions how maybe he had assistants on the outside. Nevertheless, he keeps printing the newspaper. And he keeps printing slogans like this one. Voice of the people is the voice of God. It's a very populist slogan. And he also writes articles like this. Quote, "We first committed a successful forgery on a native of Bengal and gloried in it," talking about the British. "And then a native of the country who knew nothing of English laws is hanged for a crime which we had triumphed in committing." Who is Hicky talking about? Well, he's talking about Robert Clive. He's actually saying Clive was made a peer in England, though he committed in Bengal the same crime for which we hanged a man named Nanda Kumar. This was a rival of Warren Hastings, actually, Nanda Kumar. So he's calling out the hypocrisy of some British rule, British law. Eventually, this becomes too much. And in fact, in March 30th, 1782, the Supreme Court issues an order, and they seize Hicky's printing press. They seize his types, they seize his papers. And this is the very last issue of Hicky's Bengal Gazette. The last one before they seized all the, before Hastings seized all the printing presses. So what comes of this? What happens? Well, there is some just desserts. There's some revenge. Parliament recalls Warren Hastings, as you might remember from your history books, recalls Hastings to be impeached. And there's 22 charges, everything from soliciting bribes, launching wars of aggression. And many of these abuses of power were actually first printed in Hicky's Bengal Gazette. And the publicity in the newspaper, I have evidence to suggest it helped furnish the parliamentary investigators with evidence against Warren Hastings. Ultimately, Hastings was acquitted. Also, Chief Justice Elijah Impey was impeached, and he was also acquitted like Hastings. In 1802, Hicky dies. He dies on a boat to China. And during his last years of his life, he attempted to restart his newspaper, but that failed. He didn't find much luck in the business. But Hicky dies in 1802. He's on a boat to China, and I don't know why. Maybe as a merchant, maybe practicing surgery, but nonetheless, we can look back at his life and we can draw a few, I hope, useful lessons. Why are we talking about this and why is this important? Well, first, many later printers would follow in his footsteps. He would be a model for journalists later in India. And second, we can think about news today. We can think about Facebook. We can think about Twitter. We can think of them as both democratizing and also divisive. And a newspaper in the 18th century was very similar to what social media might be to us now. It's a place where ideas flourish, but also where there's disinformation and there's division. And one of the things that ultimately doomed Hicky's Gazette was that it had all these radical political ideas that I think is really important to know about now, but it also made the mistake of an ill-timed insult against the Governor General. And I think these are all really important things to remember. And we can look at the way freedom of the press was fought for, not just now, but 200 years ago. And these are things that I wanted to tell you about today in this chat. So if you want to know more, you can always pick up a copy of my book. It goes into more detail. And that's all. I hope you enjoyed the chat, and I'm glad to answer any questions afterwards and to go into any more detail. Thanks.
Let me take you through some of the questions that people have raised.
Yep.
I think there's been a lot of discussion about the long S and where it's found, and it was seen on cemeteries outside England and so on. So maybe you can tell us first a little bit about the long S and the short S and the differences between the two of them.
Yeah. So the long S. Can I share my screen again? All right. So I'm going to go back to the slide. I'll show you a copy of that long S again. So the difference between the long S and the regular S is actually this it's a nub here. Long S and the F. The F would have it on both sides, the long S just on one side. And this is often used with an S as well. So we have S and F. I don't quite know exactly why the long S came into fashion, why it was used in the first place, but it appears to derive from uses in Latin. And it was carried through as sort of a tradition in English printing, and it fell out in the 18th century. I've read that it fell out often from simplicity's sake. Printers didn't want to have to carry a second. They didn't want to have to carry a second letter, an additional letter, when a regular S would suffice.
There's a question whether the first copy is available at the National Library in Kolkata, or did you say that the first copy is no longer available?
The first copy is available at the National Library. It's unfortunately in very poor condition. The preservation has been not very good, but it's there. It's there.
So Kuchal also wanted to know if the newspaper covered the French Revolution of 1789.
No, the newspaper was shut down in 1782, so it didn't have the chance to cover that.
So Farooq has a question. Could you tell us a little bit about other newspapers that came up after Hicky's? I'm sure they were inspired, and how long did they survive?
Yeah, so there were two really important newspapers. One is by another Irishman, actually, called William Duane. And he also wrote, very similar to Hicky, he wrote in support of the East India Company Army against the governors, the governor generals. And that was also shut down. The editor was deported to England, and the editor actually became a personal friend of Thomas Jefferson in the United States. There's also the Bengal Gazette, which I believe was the first Indian-owned newspaper, and some people have said that the name, the Bengal Gazette, was directly taken from Hicky's Bengal Gazette. So the first Indian-owned newspaper paid homage to the first newspaper in India.
So Indians reminds me that were there any Indians on the staff, and were there any Indians amongst the 400 readers to whom the paper went to?
On the staff, it's really hard to tell. I don't have records of who exactly worked on it. It's likely that there were members of the staff who were Indian, who were typesetters, perhaps. It's also likely there were Anglo-Indians on the staff. You needed to have a high-level English literacy, and that usually would have meant hiring Anglo-Indian. But I don't have specific details. The readership was mostly European, although I have a few instances of advertisements by Indian businessmen. So there were Indians who read it, but I think it was generally an Anglo-Indian or a European, primarily newspaper.
So you told us about some two newspapers, right, which had the same slogan. So was the slogan, did the slogan travel beyond America is Shine's question.
If you can find out more details, please let me know. I've only seen the slogan in America and in Hickey's Bengal Gazette. I've never seen it anywhere else. I've done significant research on it, but I just haven't come across it yet.
Rish wants to know where in Kolkata did you find the book or the notes of Judge John Hyde? I think you mentioned the library, but is that correct?
Oh, very fascinating. Oh, this is so if you want to go, I found it. It's a long and complicated and actually very sad story. The notebooks are now held in the Victoria Memorial. There is microfilm in the National Library, and they have been digitized, the original notebooks, by Jadavpur University. Unfortunately, they're not giving access to the public, but if you want to see the notebooks, type in that phrase to the internet. My colleague, Carol Siri Johnson, she has taken all the microfilm and she's digitized it. You can actually see, you can read the microfilm. Hyde Books. It's like Hyde Books, and then type in NJIT. Type that into Google, and it'll show up.
Okay, I hope you can figure that out. Because Nand Kumar says that the first political murder was the one of Nanda Kumar, which Navpreet says. I think somebody's commented that Ankur's commented that he's terrified to look at Madras University archives. So I guess that's true of a lot of archives. We were discussing this earlier today that our weather doesn't help that either to maintain the records.
Yeah. There's many reasons. I've an archivist. There's lack of funding. There's weather. I don't want to imply that people don't care. I just think there's it's more difficult sometimes.
So Shah had a question as to if somebody were researching Indian history, Bombay in particular, what archival sources are accessible digitally and ideally at low costs and minimal costs?
What sources are digitally available for Indian history? You want to research? There's a lot. The National Archives in Delhi, they have a website. It has a Hindi name, and I can't quite recall the specifics. But if you Google it, there's a you'll find the National Archives. Yeah, Abhilek Patel. Thank you. That is quite good for online resources. But it's hard. I think the one problem with doing research in Indian history, and particularly at least the area that I focus on, is there's comparatively few resources available online, so it's more challenging.
want to have some personal costs about Hickey. What business did he do before he got into printing?
What did he do before he got into printing? He landed in Calcutta and he actually practiced surgery for the first couple of years. And I have some really interesting documents from the High Court of Calcutta. I think I was the first person to see these documents, where Hickey is basically his patients didn't pay him for the surgery, so he's trying to find them and get them to pay up the money. So Hickey practiced surgery, and he also he worked as a small-time merchant, so he would ship goods between the south of India, like Tranquilbar, Madras, Cuddalore, and Calcutta. So he was a merchant and a surgeon. So he did two jobs back to back. And those actually, when one of his ships sunk or was badly damaged, that's why he got into jail. He got into debt because of that.
Arvish had a question about how you were interested in Bengal and the newspaper, but I think you had already shared that. Maybe you joined us later. Zina has a question whether his political views had anything to do with the fact that he was of Irish ancestry. Any idea whether he was Catholic or Protestant?
Very good question. I do not know whether his political views had to do with his Irish ancestry. That said, I suspect they did, because there's obviously the British colonized, the English colonized Ireland as well. So I'm sure that factored in. As to whether Hickey was Catholic or Protestant, I have no evidence to suggest one way or the other. In many ways, his ideological positions actually stemmed from, I suspect, from personal grievances against Warren Hastings. There was I didn't talk about this, but there was a contract that Hickey had with the East India Company before he made a newspaper, and Hastings intervened in that contract and essentially prevented Hickey from being paid about 40,000 rupees. And Hastings gave the contract to two other printers. So there's personal bad blood between Hickey and Hastings.
Did he have any assistant? Did he figure out if he had people who were helping him print the paper while he was in jail? How that happened?
Good question. Specifically, I don't know. I suspect that he still owned the printing shop outside. So I suspect that he had assistants who would shuttle information between the printing shop and the jail where he was, but that's anyone's guess, really.
Sankur made an observation that you shared a photo of Warren Hastings with his wife, and there was a native girl in the picture. Would that be someone who was a servant, and was it a normal thing to paint a servant in a photograph, in a portrait of that
kind? There's been actually Warren Hastings and his bull, I believe, was a short story. Have you heard about that? There's been, I don't recall the specific details, but there's been some interesting talk about this Indian girl who was in that painting. I have seen in other paintings of these upper class British, I've seen Indians in them, but this one is more unique for this time period. I've never quite seen like one person individually, and who this girl is, I really don't know, but it's definitely worth looking into.
I think someone can pursue this query.
Yeah. I recall there's been a short story or a novel that's been made about this, something like.
So Madhusudan wants to know if there are other similarities between the American newspapers and the Bengal Gazette, other than, of course, the motto that you shared with us.
Are people wondering if there are other similarities?
Yeah.
Yes. Trying to think specifics. So, one major difference is that, newspapers in America date to 1690. So, newspapers in America and 13 colonies then have an extra 100 years of history. So there's much longer and much more, richer debate between these papers. And there were pro-revolution newspapers and anti-revolution newspapers. And so many of the sentiments in Hickey's Bengal Gazette are actually very similar in the 13 colonies in America. And I suspect that if Hickey's Bengal Gazette was able to exist longer, then we would have seen a dialogue. And actually, in fact, newspaper articles that were printed in Hickey's Bengal Gazette, they found their way. Actually, they were reprinted in American newspapers. In fact, the American newspapers particularly liked when there's a battle of Polalore. There's a famous battle in South India, and the British were defeated by Mysore and Hyder Ali, and the American newspapers loved this stuff. They printed all the excerpts from Hickey's Bengal Gazette about the British defeat, and this was front page news in America. So there was a dialogue, and I think if Hickey's Bengal Gazette lasted for longer than 2 years, we would have seen a lot more.
Yeah, it would have only taken 6 months for the news to travel up and down like you started your.
Yeah.
And Anu seems disappointed that did anybody carry forward the newspaper in press, or did they just?
I mean, after Hickey was shut down, did anyone carry it forward? The short answer is no. There were other newspapers, but they were effectively controlled by East India Company government. They were pro-government mouthpieces, and the reason for that is quite simple. Warren Hastings had effectively secured all levers of government power. I mean, I mentioned he had corrupted the Supreme Court, and so the legal avenues, if you want to challenge this authority, were very limited.
That brings us to Farooq's comment that now we know that the Rowlatt Act of 1920s has a rich history of, clampdown of the press before that. So they were aware of what press can sort of damage.
Yeah. It was very interesting, actually. When Hickey's Bengal Gazette first came out, Warren Hastings actually supported this. There's often literature about Hastings wanting, talking about how he wanted to improve the knowledge of Indian culture for the Europeans so they can better be governed. So in many ways, Hastings likely thought about Hickey's Bengal Gazette as like another tool that he could employ. But when Hickey sort of went against Hastings' policy, that's when Hastings shut down the newspaper.
Ankur's commented that the National Archives, Delhi building and the IGNU building are probably going to be shifted because of the Central Vista redevelopment. And Mukesh has commented, there's a question whether archiving for future records will become easier or more difficult because of this digital age. Will the digital technology changing every few years and no standardization? Is there a standardization so that these archives can be retrieved, a few years later? We already know that our tapes and our, various kinds of media have become redundant over the last 20 years. So I did read something about how this will change data retrieval later. Your thoughts on that?
Difficult to say. I mean, we're really in a revolutionary period of archival history, right? Where, for the first time, I can do my research from my computer here. I can't do all of it, but I can do some. I think one of the real dangers actually lies not in the compatibility of technology. I think it actually lies in a lot of researchers effectively just being lazy, and because there is information online, they don't go out and do the research. I have a personal example. There are these memoirs that of Hickey's lawyer actually wrote these really, really beautiful, detailed memoirs, and they've been digitized, they've been quoted extensively, but if you actually go and read the original memoirs, you can tell that they left out about half of them when they went to publish and digitize. So there's so much more information that is very, very valuable. But as far as I'm aware, no one else has cited the original memoirs. People have only cited the digital. So there's going to be, I'm afraid, a lot of things that will fall through the cracks in digitalization.
Interesting. Scary too. Farooq wants to know if we know the exact location of the jail that Hicky was in Calcutta.
Exact location. Yes. In fact, I could tell you that specifically. I'd have to consult my sources. Both the jails do not exist anymore. One was in an old mansion that had been converted into the jail near Esplanade area in Calcutta, and the other one would have been on the southeast corner of the Maidan, but that sort of near where the Victoria Memorial is now, a little away from that, but close to that.
Shorendu has an interesting question. How did news travel around the world then? I mean, were there any syndications, and how did news really travel before newspapers came out?
So news traveled honestly by letter, and it traveled by ship. There were no syndications. You have Associated Press now or Reuters; those didn't exist. You would have if you were a newspaper in India, you would have a friend or a correspondent in some way, and you might contract with them to send you letters from locations. So actually, let me share my screen again, and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. All right, so this is a letter from Aleppo. So, and this person from Aleppo has a letter from London, right? So Hicky likely had a friend or a contact in Aleppo in Syria who was forwarding him letters overland from London, which had already been forwarded by boat from America. So you can see there's this chain from America to London to Aleppo, and it all has to be done by your personal contacts.
And the last question is from Kushal. He wants to know if you managed to meet any descendants from Hicky's family.
I tried a lot. Do you know anyone? I can't tell you how much I've tried to meet a descendant, but if anyone knows anyone, please let me know.
So Biswaroop Ray would like to know if the hanging of Nandakumar featured in the Gazette. Isn't that what you were referring to?
Yes, absolutely. That was the article. The hanging of Nandakumar occurred in 1774, 1775. The newspaper Hicky's Gazette was printed in 1780, 1781. So Hicky is, referring back to that event. Nandakumar was a rival of Warren Hastings for government positions, and a long, complicated story, but he was hanged for a forgery that may or may not have happened. And it's the same crime that Clive committed, but Clive was celebrated as a hero, which is Hicky pointing out, whereas Nandakumar was hung for forgery.
Shrikant Yati wants to know how the newspapers were generating revenue at the time. Was there advertisement? Was there for them?
So revenue is from two sources. It's from advertisement, and it's also from circulation, subscriptions. The revenue for the newspaper would have been about 2,000 rupees a month, which at that time was actually quite significant. And I don't have an exact breakdown. I don't have ledgers. I don't know exactly what percent comes from advertising and what percent comes from circulation.
Any more questions? Okay, Ram Kumar has a question. Ram says, was Hicky's Bengal Gazette printed by the first printing press imported into India by Bhimji Parekh?
I believe you must be referring to the printing press in Bombay, which was in the 1600s. I have no evidence to suggest that being the case. I think it's more likely because Hicky, when he was a teenager, had apprenticed to a printing shop, so he would have had the knowledge for how to build a printing press and how to make types. So it's more likely that he hired local carpenters to do the work in Calcutta. If I can say one thing, I think it's really important to note it's actually Hicky and not Hickey, so there's no E in the name, just an FYI.
Okay, so everyone must note it is Hickey. Biswaroop Ray wants to know where Hickey stayed in Kolkata.
Yes, Hickey stayed in Kalinga, which would have been a little, I can't remember my geography. It would be close to what is now Park Street, but a little bit off on a side street. And his printing press was in Radha Bazaar. So he would have, he lived in a garden house. So he had some fruit trees in the yard, and certainly the house doesn't exist anymore. And then he would have commuted to the printing office in Radha Bazaar.
I think Shrishti asked this question earlier and I missed it. Wants to know if it was a rival newspaper to the Gazette that was established in the same year, and it was called, was it India Gazette? And is there more information about that?
Yeah, yes. So I didn't talk about this in the chat, but there was absolutely the India Gazette, which was founded about 10 months after Hickey's Gazette, 11 months. And the India Gazette was a pro East India Company, pro government newspaper. And it was funded in large part by associates of Warren Hastings. So it was, I've read through pretty much the entirety of the newspaper, and it was effectively a pro-government mouthpiece.
So this was the only news, right? So the news was this dominated by the British government versus the Indian political leaders? Was, I guess, determined by whether the editors or were pro or anti-government, isn't it?
That's a difficult question to answer, and one of the reasons is we're often talking about the European sphere. So I don't know to the extent that Indian political leaders at this time in 1780 would have had an impact. I would say that there was definitely one of the challenges Hickey faced was, how far could he push things? What level of independence did he have from East India Company government? And effectively, he probably pushed a little too far in what they were willing to be able to give him. And so ultimately, the East India Company had dominance over what Hickey could say. And in many reasons, that's because Warren Hastings controlled the levers of power. I mean, there was supposed to be, according to the Regulating Act of 1774, the East India Company was supposed to have an independent Supreme Court that would arbitrate and would secure the rights of individuals. Now, unfortunately, Hastings had bribed the 2 of the 3 judges, so that didn't exist. And so there was effectively no legal recourse for anyone such as Hickey who wanted to defend freedom of speech and freedom of the press, which, bear in mind, is actually, in British common law, there is freedom of the press and freedom of speech. So Hickey didn't really have a legal recourse if he wanted to challenge that. So you're kind of, in American, our slang would be, he was up shit's creek. There's not much he could do. The second question about how editors would decide relevance and pick the news, it's a much smaller operation. You're only printing less than 1,000 copies a week, and it's only once a week. So Hickey probably was, he was the editor. He was the one who would decide what was relevant, what wasn't. And he would have staff assistants that would help him. But ultimately, he was sort of the buck would stop with him. He was the one who would make the decision.
And there was really no Indian representative in the media, right? So it was European versus a European with their different points of view.
Yeah, at this time, it would have been European versus European. And keep in mind, the Hickey is, like we talked about, Irish. He comes from a lower, or which is probably a lower class background. And so there's a class element to this, a really important class element. I think it's also important to note that if you want to look at the history of newspapers in India, you can look at that sort of like a family tree. Hickey trained printers and assistants, and those printers assistants, I have evidence proving that they had Indian printers and assistants, and those Indian printers assistants founded some of the first newspapers. So Hickey trained a man named Paul Ferris. Paul Ferris trained Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya, who founded the Bengal Gazette, which was named after Hickey's newspaper, and that was the first newspaper printed by an Indian. And you also have individuals like Ram Mohan Roy, and so they get their heritage and their training and their tradition from some of these really early newspapers in Calcutta. So there's this connection. It might not be very direct, but it's definitely there.
Very true. I think Satori wants to know what happened to the second judge, because I think 2 judges out of 3, I think, were.
So you're referring to John Hyde, the so-called honest judge that I talked about. So Hyde, he wrote these secret notebooks, and his intent was that it was going to be a record of what happened, like a true record on the court. And he wanted to send the notebooks back to England to be published. He never did, actually. He kept these a secret. The notebooks weren't a secret themselves. He kept the code, that aspect, a secret till he died. And we only found out 240 years later. So he lived, the court changed, new judges arrived, and so he kept his position, he kept his mouth shut, but he was honest at least.
Shaswati wants to know if you can tell the name again of the person whom Hickey taught the art of printing, and therefore who further taught the next person who moved to Bengal Gazette.
Yeah, his name is Paul Ferris, and then that would lead to Ganga Kishore Charya. It's not something like Kishore, not Kishore. And it's also which I'm sure you know. I will show you one thing that I think is kind of cool. Let me share my screen again. All right, so you see P. Ferris up here. So when Paul Ferris, right? When Hickey died, Paul Ferris bought a lot of copies of Hickey's Bengal Gazette on Hickey's death. And I suspect that the only reason this collection survives is because Paul Ferris bought it and then preserved it. And then Paul Ferris would have shown this to Ganga Kishore Bhattacharya and others. So it literally has Paul Ferris's name on it. Wow. Pretty cool, right?
Fantastic. If there are no more questions, I think we can wind it down. Thank you so much. This has been an amazing amount of information that I think we all have not even given any thought to. And sort of you're leaving us, with so many questions that we can now further explore. And I know that many people here will, including myself. Thank you very much. And I hope that everyone stays safe and gets vaccinated soon and tide over these bad times. Thank you so much.